All right, good morning, Hershey. So this morning I'm going to start with a short story that's not from the book of Jonah, but which I think ties well into chapter 1. All right, so there was once a young man, and he was training to be a lawyer. All right, and this is not me, just in case you think that you're guessing where this story is going. For those of you who don't attend Hershey regularly, I did train to be a lawyer, but this story is not about me. So this young man was training to be a lawyer. He had gone through his schooling. He had even purchased the book that in his day all lawyers need to purchase to practice their profession. All right, and one day he was traveling, he was walking, and there was a thunderstorm. And in this thunderstorm, the lightning was crashing, thunder was roiling, and he was terrified of this storm. And so finally, terrified for his life, he calls out, and he says, he prays to a saint, he says, "Saint Anne, save me, and I will become a monk." So I promise that this morning I will not spend most of the morning in teacher mode, although I did tell Carl that if he's not paying attention, I was going to call him out, all right? So I won't be in teacher mode most of the time, but I do have a couple of questions to start. And does anyone know who this young man was? Olivia really hopes that someone else knows, because she's my plant. She learned this last year in history class. Olivia, who was it? Martin Luther. Not Martin Luther King, just Martin Luther. All right, so Martin Luther originally trained to be a lawyer, and he had this experience where he said during the storm, if you save my life, I will become a monk. And that Martin Luther became a monk, but then he went on to start the Reformation. And although he had some unkind things to say about Anabaptists, we probably wouldn't be here having church today like we are if not for his conversion experience. And we will come back to that in just a moment. So as you know, as Elmer said, I'm going to be preaching on the book of Jonah, 4 Sundays, 1 chapter each Sunday. It seemed like a good idea back in February when I talked to Joe about it. Maybe less so this morning. But before we turn to the book of Jonah itself, I did want to give you just the barest minimum of historical context. All right? And then I'll just read chapter 1, and we will go through the text of chapter 1 and see what we can learn from that. All right? But we know a little bit about the prophet Jonah. He served during the reign of Jeroboam II. And if you have, your kings of Judah and Israel memorized, which I don't know, I don't have them memorized, but Jeroboam II would have reigned between the years, and it's always hard to calculate this, but between the years of 785 and 750 BC. All right, so Jonah is a prophet in the northern kingdom of Israel, and as you know, Israel is going to be conquered and taken into captivity, and that will happen in 722. So we're not very far off Israel being conquered, all right? And this information doesn't come from the book of Jonah itself. It actually comes from 2 Kings, where Jonah is also mentioned. All right, so that's it. That's the historical context. So let me read chapter 1. Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, "Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me." But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. Then the mariners were afraid, and each cried out to his God. And they hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for them. But Jonah had gone down into the inner part of the ship and had lain down and was fast asleep. So the captain came and said to him, "What do you mean, you sleeper? Arise, call out to your God. Perhaps the God will give a thought to us, that we may not perish." And they said to one another, "Come, let us cast lots, that we may know on whose account this evil has come upon us." So they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. Then they said to him, "Tell us, on whose account this evil has come upon us? What is your occupation, and where do you come from? What is your country, and of what people are you?" And he said to them, "I am a Hebrew, and I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." Then the men were exceedingly afraid and said to him, "What is this that you have done?" For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord, because he had told them. Then they said to him, "What shall we do to you, that the sea may quiet down for us?" For the sea grew more and more tempestuous. He said to them, "Pick me up and hurl me into the sea. Then the sea will quiet down for you. For I know it is because of me that this great tempest has come upon you." Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to get back to dry land, but they could not, for the sea grew more and more tempestuous against them. Therefore they called out to the Lord, "O Lord, let us not perish for this man's life, and lay not on us innocent blood. For you, O Lord, have done as it pleased you." So they picked up Jonah and hurled him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. Then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. And the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. So, God calls Jonah. He speaks directly to his prophet, and he gives him a simple job. Go to the city of Nineveh and call out against it. This was a simple job, but not an easy one. We shouldn't confuse those two things. Because Nineveh was part of the Assyrian Empire, and the Assyrians were evil, to put it bluntly. All right, they were an expansionist empire. They were always looking to grow their territory, and they would be the ones to conquer Israel in just 30 to 50 years. And we know both from biblical sources and other historical sources that the Assyrians were cruel to the people that they conquered. Not only did they remove them from their land and take the people into captivity, Israel would not be the only nation that was taken into captivity by the Assyrians. They also treated people cruelly. They used tortures like chopping off limbs and gouging out eyes on the people that they conquered. There's even a historical account of one king who brags about the tower of heads that he made from his conquered enemies. So they were evil. And this evil had come to God's attention. That's what God says. Their evil has come up before me. And so he was moved by this evil, God was, and he wanted it to stop. Now, this should not have surprised Jonah. He knew that God was and is God of the entire world, of all of creation. This was kind of different than most people would have believed back in the ancient Near East, 2,700 years ago. Most people would have believed that their God was just the God of like their area, or even just one specific thing. You'd have the God of fish or something like that, all right? But Israel was different, and they believed that their God was God of everything. And we see this later in the chapter where Jonah tells the sailors, he says, my God is God of the sea and the dry land, all right? And what he's doing there is like that's a figure of speech, and he's taking two opposite things, the sea and the dry land, opposite things, and so those two opposite things mean everything. Like it's a figure of speech for the totality, all right? So Jonah knows this. He knows that God is God of Assyria and not just the God of Israel. And so it shouldn't really have surprised him that God was concerned about the evil of the Assyrians. But the call still might have been a bit unexpected for Jonah, all right? Because we know the history of Judah and also Israel, especially Israel, that they were not really faithful in their worship of God, right? You know, you can look back if you read through 2 Kings, 1 Kings, and Chronicles, and every king of Israel, you know, it says they did what was evil in God's sight. Like the people of Israel at this time were more likely to worship the other nations' gods than to go and tell them about the one true God. All right? And so it may have been surprising to Jonah that he was called to be a missionary because in some respects he is the first missionary. All right? At least the first one that the Bible tells us about, where he's called to go to a people who don't know God and bring them a message. So on the one hand, not surprising that God is God of the whole world. On the other hand, somewhat surprising that he is supposed to be the first missionary. Now, I think the text is clear that Jonah got this call. Like, he knew what he was supposed to do. All right? Now, we don't know, like, how the call came to Jonah. Like, did he hear an audible voice from God? Like, if you and I had been in the room with him when God's call came, would we have heard those words out loud? Or was it, you know, in his head that he heard God speaking to him? I mean, or maybe he didn't even hear words at all, although the text, I think, suggests that he did, but maybe he just had this, like, growing sense, as we sometimes do, of what God wanted him to do. That he needed to get up, he needed to go, and he needed to speak out against this city of Nineveh. But he knew that. He knew what the call was. And Jonah is not interested in this job. He's like, no, not interested. He doesn't even pause to argue with God, or, you know, maybe he did, and the text just doesn't tell us that, but he's just like, nope, sorry, and he runs away. He runs away from God's call. He goes to Tarshish. Now, I don't think it's random that Jonah chose to go to Tarshish, all right? It's not like it was on his bucket list, and he's like, well, this is a good time for a vacation, so let me just head over there. Because if you look at a map of the ancient Near East, where Jonah lived, you can see that Nineveh is in the Far East. Not as far away as you could go in the known world at the time, all right, but pretty far. It's in today what we call Iraq, the country of Iraq, northern Iraq. So very far away from where Jonah was living in Israel, and almost on the edge of the known world. Now, we don't know exactly where the city of Tarshish was located in Jonah's day, but some scholars speculate that it was in Spain, which would have been on the western edge of the known world. So in a sense, what Jonah is doing, if this is accurate, like the scholars' interpretation of where this city is, what Jonah is doing is he is saying, I'm going to be going in the opposite direction of what you're calling me to do, God, and I'm going to get away as far as I possibly can from what you've called me to do. Now, one of my favorite things about the book of Jonah is the way that the author uses words in very precise and specific ways. I guess it's the English teacher coming out, all right? And I'm going to try to highlight some of these. There's lots of them. We don't have time to see all of them, but I'm going to try to highlight some of them as we go through this. And one of the first ones is in verses 3 to 6. You'll notice the author repeats the word down 4 times. All right, he says that Jonah went down to Joppa and he went down into the boat, and he went down into the inner part of the boat, and then he lay down to sleep. And I think the author, in using these words in this way, wants us to see that Jonah is doing more than just running away from God. He's doing that, clearly, but he's doing something a little bit more than that. You see, in the ancient Near East, they had an entirely different cosmology than what we have. And cosmology is a fancy word for like how you understand the universe. All right? And, we understand our universe in that we live on a globe, right? A sphere that's held up by gravity somehow. I mean, I say we understand, like we believe that. Maybe we don't really understand how it works, but we orbit around a sun, and that's our cosmology, right? But Jonah would not have thought that about the earth at all. He had an entirely different cosmology. And there's a lot of detail here. Their cosmology was as developed as ours is. But really briefly, Jonah would have believed that the earth was flat, all right? And people lived, obviously, on the surface of the earth. But then when you died, you went inside the earth. There was the land of the dead, all right? And this was called Sheol. That was the name for it. And so, like, if you were a kid and you were like, hey, I want to, go to China, I'm going to dig a hole down through the earth, like, kids in Jonah's day wouldn't have done that, right? Like, because why would you want to dig down through the earth? Because all you do is come to the place of the dead, and you don't want to go to the place of the dead any earlier than you have to, all right? And so when Jonah is described as going down into the boat, lying down to sleep, like, I think the author wants us to see that he is choosing death. He's not just running away from God. He is choosing death. And each step that he takes him one step closer to this place of the dead. And it looks a little bit like death is coming for Jonah, right? Like, God hurls a storm, and it looks like the boat is going to sink. And the mariners, the sailors, their ship is falling apart, and they're tossing cargo overboard. And what did they do? Each one of them calls out to their God, which is the opposite of what Jonah did. And you'll see that throughout, especially this chapter, but really throughout the whole book of Jonah, that we have this faithless prophet. And then we have unbelievers, people who didn't know God, who respond in positive ways to him. You'll see that contrast. So the sailors are calling out each to their God, and the captain, he's like, I'm sure there was another guy around here somewhere. Where's he? And so he goes down to the boat, and he finds Jonah sleeping. And we'll come back to how it is that Jonah managed to sleep through this storm. But notice the words that the captain says to Jonah. He says, arise, call. And where have we heard those words before? Those are the same words that God said to Jonah. In verse 2, God told him, arise, go, call out against the city. All right, it's almost as if God is speaking to his prophet through this unbeliever. All right, so the sailors, they cast lots to determine who's at fault for this disaster, and the lot falls on Jonah. And Jonah, he doesn't hide what he's done. He's not deceptive here. The sailors are shocked. What is this you have done, they say. These men, they don't worship Yahweh. They don't know who the true God is. All right? They had their own gods. And we don't really know how familiar. They probably had heard of Israel's God, but we don't know how familiar they would have been with him. But at the moment, they're very familiar with this God. They know the power that this God has because their ship is about to sink, right? They can see his power. And so they cannot understand what a fool Jonah is for trying to run away from this God. Now, the sailors could have taken the easy way out, right? They could have chucked Jonah overboard. Probably done that as soon as he had confessed that he was running away from his God. It's like, why are we putting up with this guy? All right? Certainly after he told them, hey, if you want to get this storm to stop, just throw me overboard, I feel like they would have been the smart thing to do. But no, again, there's a contrast between these unbelievers and Jonah. They do the hard thing. Jonah wasn't willing to do the hard thing, but they do the hard thing. All right? They row like crazy. They try to get back to land, but they can't. All right? So finally, they throw Jonah overboard. And you can hear the reluctance in their voice as they plead to God, don't hold this man's innocent blood against us. We really don't want to be doing this, but we feel like we have no choice. Now, I wonder if maybe there were other options, but those options were in Jonah's hands, right? And we'll probably talk more about this next week when we look at chapter 2, but why didn't Jonah be like, all right, guys, why don't you just turn the boat around, take me back to Joppa, I'll go to Nineveh. Maybe that would have stopped the storm too, but Jonah's like, nope, you got to throw me overboard. That's the only way, all right? Because, again, by saying throw me overboard, Jonah is not saying here, I'll do what God wants me to do, all right? Again, what he's doing here is he is choosing death. He doesn't know what's going to happen. He doesn't, let's be honest, he says, look, the storm will stop if you throw me overboard, but he doesn't really know that. I mean, he probably guesses that, and it was a good guess, he's right, all right, but he doesn't know that because God hasn't told him that. This is God's doing, not Jonah's, all right? And so Jonah is making one last attempt to get away from God. He's choosing death over obedience. And then, of course, there's the plot twist, which is why we like the story of Jonah, because it's just crazy. God will not let him get away. And so there's a big fish that comes along and swallows Jonah. Not just because it happened to be there, but because God sent it there. All right, so as I read over this chapter, I'm struck with two really big questions. I'm sure there are more questions, but there are two that I'm going to ask this morning. And like all good questions, these don't have simple answers, right? But I think that by looking at them, considering them together, we can learn something about God and something about ourselves. So the first question, why did Jonah run away? Ever stop and think about that? Why did he try to run to Tarshish? I mean, it makes for a good story. If he hadn't, we wouldn't have ended up in the boat. We wouldn't be able to talk about the fish. All right, but why did he do that? I mean, he could have just been like, nope, not going. Sorry, God. I'll retire from being a prophet. Don't want to go to Nineveh. Find somebody else. And then continued with his life in Israel, right? He could have done that. And how is going to Tarshish going to help him? He knew that God was God in Tarshish as he was God in Israel. All right? He wasn't going to get away from God. So why did he run? And I think Jonah ran away because he was trying to get away from God's voice. He ran away hoping he wouldn't have to listen to God speaking to him. My image of the prophet at this time is like a man who is continually hearing the voice of God, continually hearing those words, arise, go, call. Arise, go, call. He just keeps hearing that. And he can't rid himself of these words. He keeps telling God, no, I'm not going to do it, and God keeps calling him to do it. He can't think, he can't sleep, he can't do anything but hear these words. So he runs. So he leaves Israel, hoping that That'll do the trick. That'll get him away from God's voice. Now, this might strike us as silly, because if God can speak to Jonah in Israel, he can speak to him in Tarshish or wherever he goes. And yet, as silly as it seems, if you look closely at the text, it appears that Jonah's plan works. Because whether or not God stops speaking to Jonah, Jonah stops being able to hear God's voice. When Jonah leaves Israel and gets to Joppa and gets on the boat, there's no record in the text of God speaking to Jonah anymore. Like there's no more words that God uses. Obviously, God is still speaking to him, and we'll talk about the ways that he is. They're pretty obvious. But he's not using words. And I think we see this because Jonah is able to sleep. He gets on the boat, and the first thing he does is go to sleep. Well, I don't think he would have been able to sleep if God was still talking to him. And he must have been really tired, too, because he was able to sleep through this storm. All right, so finally, he has what he wants. He's drowned out the voice of God. And that should make us pause a little bit, pay attention, because we don't want to be in that position where we drown out the voice of God, where we make choices that prevent us from hearing his voice. I think this part of Jonah's story is a warning to all of us that we need to think about our choices and think about how we might be drowning out the voice of God in our lives. Now, as I said, God's still speaking to Jonah. He's using the storm. He's using the sailors. He even puts his own words, I think, in the voice of the captain who gives Jonah that call again, arise and call out. All right? And then, of course, he'll use the fish, and we'll see next week how that finally changes Jonah. All right? So, that's the first question. Why did Jonah run? Second question, why did God choose Jonah? Why did God choose this stubborn, obstinate prophet if he knew the man was just going to run off? If God knew that Jonah was going to cause all this trouble, why not find someone a bit more willing? I mean, surely there had to be someone in Israel a bit more pliable than Jonah was. Someone who wouldn't require a storm and a fish to finally accept the job that God needed doing. I have two possible answers to this question. Again, I'm sure there are others, but these are the two that I have for this morning. First, maybe Jonah was the only one in Israel who could carry God's message. This answer might be hard to accept. The population of Israel at this time was nearly 500,000 people. If you add Judah into that, you have 850,000 people. It just seems likely that there would have been someone else with the gifts, the ability to go to Nineveh and call out against it. And when we get to chapter 3, we'll see that, once Jonah finally did what God wanted him to do, he didn't do a great job. His sermon was 5 words long. It's not like he spent, hours and hours putting those 5 words together. So it seems unlikely that no one else could have done the job that Jonah did. And yet, Jonah was God's prophet, as we know from 2 Kings. So he must have had some gift, some reason for God's calling on his life. And here's something to think about. And I don't know that this is true. I'd like to think that it is. But God's gifts don't go away. The things that God gives us, they don't go away. We can run from them, like Jonah did. We can ignore them. We can shut them away, lock them up, deny them. But they don't go away. They might weaken with disuse. If we stray too far from God's purposes, we might not be able to access and use the gifts that he's given us. But they are still with us, still a part of who God made us to be. And we can always, through repentance and discipline, return to them. Another way of saying the same thing is what one of my colleagues at school often tells our students. He says, "You were created with a unique God-given purpose that only you can fulfill." Let me repeat that. You were created with a unique God-given purpose that only you can fulfill. If this is true, then God needed Jonah. He needed Jonah to do the work that God had created him for in the first place. He needed Jonah to fulfill his God-given purpose. And I'll be honest, this is hard for me to believe a little bit. I think part of that difficulty is the pressure. It's like, what if I mess up and miss God's call in my life? Maybe I'm still supposed to be a lawyer. I don't know. Like I made the wrong choice somewhere. What do I do then? Certainly a conversation I've had more than once. And maybe that can happen. Maybe. But it's hard to imagine missing the moment in a way worse than Jonah did, right? Like he really missed the moment. And God still used him in the end. And more than the pressure, sometimes I think this is hard for me to believe. Because if God really has a plan for me to accomplish, then I am irreplaceable in his eyes. And stop and think about that for a moment. Like you are irreplaceable in God's eyes. And I don't feel irreplaceable. Maybe you do. I don't know. And maybe I should. All right, so that's the first answer to the question, why called Jonah? Because God needed him. The second answer to that question is that maybe God was doing something in Jonah's life. So yes, God wanted a message preached to Nineveh. He wanted to call that wicked city to repentance. He wanted to save its people from the destruction that was coming its way if they didn't repent. God was doing that in the world. But God also wanted to save his prophet. Because God knew what was in Jonah's heart. Right? He knew what was causing Jonah to disobey, whether it was that Jonah was scared or lazy or bitter, whatever it was that caused Jonah to run, God knew about the reality of Jonah's heart. And so God gave Jonah this task. And the task was well within Jonah's giftings. Like he could do it. He was a prophet. But it would challenge him. And not just challenge Jonah, but it would force him to make a decision. Force him to face himself. And face the reality that he was not at a place where he could or would obey God. You see, Jonah didn't just make a single decision, right? It would be a mistake to think that all was going well in Jonah's life, that he was really operating at top level of his game, and then one day he woke up and he got this call from God and was like, nope, don't want to do that, and so he decided to run away from Tarshish. Because none of our decisions are isolated. All the choices that we make are connected in some way. And no one goes from being a prophet to being a runaway in one choice. Just like no one goes from being a lawyer to being first a monk and then the spark that lit the fire of the Reformation in one choice. Like clearly Martin Luther didn't just throw up that prayer because he had never been thinking about dedicating his life to God. He had been thinking about it for years, being called, drawn in that direction for years, until finally that thunderstorm was the way that God got him to make the decision. And in the same way, like Jonah wasn't serving God in the right way and then suddenly decided to run away from his call. Like he had been making decisions in that direction. I think it's safe to say that Jonah was already well on his way to the land of the dead, to Sheol, before God called him to go to Nineveh. C.S. Lewis, in his book Mere Christianity, offers what I think is a really good quote in this regard. Now, he does mix his metaphors a little bit. He first uses a banking metaphor and then a military metaphor, so you kind of have to piece it together. But he says, good and evil both increase at compound interest. That's the banking metaphor, all right? And you know what compound interest is, all right? That is why the little decisions you and I make every day are of such infinite importance. The smallest good act today is the capture of a strategic point from which, a few months later, you may be able to go on to victories you never dreamed of. An apparent trivial indulgence today is the loss of a ridge or a rail line or a bridgehead from which the enemy may launch an attack otherwise impossible. So sometimes we tell ourselves that, it's a trivial indulgence. It's small, it's not a big deal. It doesn't matter if I spend 15 minutes scrolling YouTube shorts, the second piece of chocolate, it's fine. I don't know what your trivial indulgences are, all right? Those are some of mine. Maybe the snooze alarm. You tell me, all right? But our choices aren't isolated, all right? Everything connects together. Now, that's not to say that Jonah was aware of this fact, all right, that he was conscious of it. Most likely he was coasting along. Most likely he thought that everything was good, because that's the easiest thing for us to do, isn't it? We tell ourselves, lie to ourselves, if we're honest, that all is good and that we're doing what God wants. But then God's call comes. And when God's call comes, Jonah's heart is laid bare. And suddenly he can see the truth of his heart. God could see it all along. God knew where Jonah was at. But now Jonah can see and make a decision. And it's painful to see the reality of our hearts sometimes. It's painful to have the consequences, the impact of our trivial indulgences exposed. But better now than later, right? Better now while we can still change. Better for Jonah to have faced his unwillingness to go to Nineveh than to continue thinking that everything was all right in his relationship with God. From this perspective, God's call was, on God's part, an act of kindness and love and a desire to draw Jonah back to himself. And that's how God works with us. He's always drawing us to himself. Sometimes he works through circumstances that we view as positive. A good relationship, an experience of beauty, an unexpected positive outcome. Like God does work through those things. And other times he works through things that we view as negative. Loss, disappointment, heartbreak. And we've all, I'm sure, had more than one of these. The key is to recognize that God is always working. So, in conclusion, what are the lessons I hope you take away from this first chapter of Jonah? First, God is always speaking, but you can block out his voice. Sometimes we have to make an effort to hear him. And don't run away like Jonah did. Second, God needs you. He needs you to do the work that he has called you to do. You were created with a God-given purpose that only you could fulfill. And third and last, God is always calling us to himself. Yes, he does have work for us to do. He is reconciling the world to himself through his son Jesus, and he wants us to play a part in that. But part of that work is that we are reconciled to him. And you probably won't be swallowed by a big fish this week, just guessing. But even if you feel like you've been swallowed by a big fish, try to see those circumstances as if God is calling you back to himself. Thank you.